Hi, everybody. I'm Brad Parker. I'm an attorney and International Advocacy Officer with Defense for Children International Palestine. Thank you. It's nice to have a great full room. Thank you, Jennifer, for the introductions. What I'm going to try to do is focus in on what it means to be a Palestinian child living today in the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. What it means to be a Palestinian child growing up under 50 years of military occupation. To give you a sense of the context, the Palestinian population, when we talk about the population generally, it is an incredibly youthful generation. The majority of the population is under 25 years old. So when we talk about Palestinian rights, we talk about violations against Palestinians. We're talking about rights violations against children, a population of children. Generations of Palestinian children grown up knowing nothing but occupation, repeated military offensives, constant settlement expansion, seeing the separation wall be built, cutting off their communities, separating their families from their land, from their livelihoods, checkpoints, closure, right? These are the things that have become inherent in 50 years of occupation against international law, as Omar mentioned, and have become pervasive, entrenched. Right? This is the infrastructure that Palestinian children interact with when they interact with Israeli military occupation. It's not something that's untangible. Right? There's a very physical presence in Palestinian children's lives for occupation. Palestinian children find themselves in this moment, today, with absolutely no leadership anywhere that is willing to challenge the systemic impunity that allows violations to continue, or a political vision that would sketch a course for the future that would end the occupation. To give a sense of where we are, there's this idea that there's a status quo that's existed, that as the peace process has sort of fallen apart, there's something that can be maintained and managed. This is false, right? Things have been deteriorating significantly over the past several years. And I'll go into a few specific issues that we've documented as Defense for Children International Palestine to give you a sense of where things are today. 2016 marked the deadliest year for Palestinian children in the West Bank in the past decade. We had at least 32 Palestinian children killed with live ammunition or crowd-controlled weapons fired by Israeli forces. In Gaza, children slip deeper into poverty. As the blockade begins its 10th year, many children are still living in protracted displacement. Significant numbers of West Bank children have also been displaced as Israel has carried out a record-breaking pace of home demolitions alongside increasing and constant settlement expansion. Equally alarming, ill treatment and torture of Palestinian children arrested by Israeli forces has continued unabated. There's been significant deteriorations that I'll mention shortly. Since 2014, Israeli forces have increased the use of live ammunition to squash protests. In 2015, we noticed this trend sort of with an uptick in violence and shootings, child fatalities, and then in 2015, it continued. In 2015, there was also regulation changes to the use of live fire, guidelines for Israeli soldiers and police. With that, combined with the systemic impunity for lack of accountability when a child is killed by Israeli forces, we had sort of the perfect storm for October 2015, when you had escalations in violence. You had stabbing attacks happening throughout the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and we saw Israeli forces respond with the intentional use of force, right, with relaxed guidelines, with zero accountability, which leads to 2016 being the deadliest year for children in the West Bank. So far in 2017, we've seen this trend continue. We've had 9 children that have been killed by live fire throughout the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And international law mandates that the use of intentional lethal force can only be used when you're challenged with lethal force. And the Israeli standard that has been changed is much below that standard. In many of the cases, we found, and even Israeli investigations have confirmed, that children did not pose a direct threat at the time that they were shot and killed by Israeli forces. Yet, in 80 cases of kids being killed with live ammunition between 2014 and now, there's only been 1 indictment. I want to turn to ill treatment of Palestinian children arrested by Israeli forces and charged in the military detention system. So we've been to Capitol Hill, we've worked on this issue, raised this issue, and I think it's the one thing that has galvanized a lot of support throughout the U.S. Because it's a very clear issue, right? You have children, Palestinian children living in the West Bank that are charged in military courts. As Omar mentioned, Israeli military law applies in the West Bank. Since 1967, when Israeli forces occupied the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, they instituted military law. So a military commander has executive, judicial, legislative authority over the entire territory. In theory, and in law, the Israeli military law applies to any person located in the territory. But Israeli authorities choose to apply military law only to the Palestinian population while providing the benefit of Israeli civilian law to Israeli citizens, Israeli settlers living in the same territory. To give you a sense of what military law is, right? It includes a lot of the similar provisions that you would expect in a criminal code, but it also includes more occupation or political offenses. For example, you have homicide, assault, and you also have being a member of a banned organization. Right? So pretty much every political party in military law. The Palestinian president could be arrested under military law, charged in the military court at any time. Specific to children, there's a specific charge: throwing stones. Throwing stones, objects against military installations, right? It comes with a potential 10-year maximum sentence under military law. Throwing stones at moving objects comes with a potential 20-year maximum sentence under international law. So children, the majority of them that are arrested by Israeli forces, charged in the military courts, the charge that they're charged with is throwing stones. A couple other important points. Under military law, soldiers can arrest on suspicion. So it's very rare that there is an actual warrant that's issued for the arrest of a child. Anything that could be used in a prosecution, it comes from that interrogation process. So the majority of children are arrested from their homes in the middle of the night. Right? Heavily armed soldiers coming into the home, banging on the door, gathering everybody in one room. If you're the 15, 16, 17-year-old boy on the list that night, your hands will be tied behind your back, blindfolded, and taken out of the home. You'll be put into a military jeep, likely transferred somewhere nearby, maybe a military camp inside of a settlement, near a settlement. And there you wait. So if you're arrested around 2 a.m., you might sit there until 6, 7, maybe even 8 a.m., waiting for an Israeli police interrogator to show up for his job in the nearby settlement police station. Kids eventually find themselves in that interrogation room. There's shouting, threats, physical violence, really everything you could imagine where you would have psychological or physical force, coercion, with the effort or with the intention of obtaining a confession or some type of incriminating statement that you could then put in a file and hand to a military prosecutor. 96 to 97% of Palestinian children are denied access to attorneys prior to interrogation. So they're bound, blindfolded, taken from their homes, Parents aren't informed where they're being taken. They essentially disappear for a 24, 48, 96-hour period where the interrogation happens. They're denied access to legal counsel. 3 out of 4 experience some form of physical violence during this period. And then they appear in a military court where they first see an attorney and their parents. For detention, we've seen a drastic deterioration in the situation for Palestinian children arrested by Israeli forces. Amid heightened violence in fall of 2015, the number of Palestinian children detained in the Israeli prison system spiked dramatically. At the end of March 2016, 444 Palestinian children were in the Israeli military detention system. This is the highest figure since the Israeli Prison Service started releasing data in January 2008. Typically, the average had been around 200 in detention at the end of the month, so this was a significant increase. The numbers now, we don't have a good sense of what they are because the Israeli Prison Service stopped releasing data in May 2016. There's been a few bits that have come out for May and June 2016, but for the past year, we really haven't had much data. 2 other pieces related to detentions. We've seen drastic spikes in the use of solitary confinement for interrogation purposes. So this is not kids being held in solitary or isolation post-sentencing, post-trial. This is pre-trial solitary confinement to facilitate interrogation. So kids are held in isolation, shuffled back and forth between prolonged interrogation sessions where they're often bound to a low metal chair in the middle of the room, questioned for hours on end, and sometimes there's also the use of informants. We've seen the use of administrative detention renewed in 2015. So this is a practice of detaining children and adults without charge or trial. In post-October 2015, it was renewed by the Israeli authorities for use against children, which for a period of about 4 years, there was no case of an administrative order used against a child. I want to just share in closing sort of a recent experience that I think is unique and gets to the heart of the things that we document and the reasons that these violations continue and why the occupation continues. So I guess a week ago on Sunday, I was in the Israeli High Court with a Palestinian father whose son was killed on May 15, 2014 by an Israeli border police officer outside of Ramallah near Offer Military Court in the West Bank. The boy, who was 17, his name was Nadim, he was shot about around 1 o'clock and killed with live ammunition. We heard about the case, we went out and checked it out at the time when it happened, and we saw CCTV cameras on the building right where Nadim was shot. We ended up being able to capture the video from those cameras, release the footage, showing that Nadim posed absolutely no threat at the time he was shot and killed with live ammunition. The initial story was the Israeli forces did not fire over any live ammunition, only rubber-coated steel bullets were fired, so he couldn't have been killed by Israeli forces because they did not fire live ammunition. And this type of denial is sort of the core of the impunity that continues to be perpetuated when it comes to accountability for cases like this. The family, so Nadim's father, Siam, he, in an effort to prove something that he already knew, that his son was killed with live ammunition, they exhumed their son's body several weeks after he was killed to have an autopsy done. The autopsy confirmed the injuries and the fatality was caused by live ammunition. There was metallic fragments in his body. And even then, the denial continued from Israeli authorities. Eventually, we built out a forensic video spatial analysis of the killing that pinpointed the specific individual that fired the lethal shot. Following that, there was an indictment. So this is the one case where there's been an indictment since 2014 out of those 80 cases. The indictment didn't come because there's some interest in justice. right? It came because there was sort of nothing that could be done to deny that this case was actually the facts that were presented. Fast forward, after a 2.5-year legal battle where Nadim's father and family have been working with Israeli prosecutors to prosecute this case, the overwhelming video, forensic evidence in this case that clearly shows Nadim's killer, right? I find myself with Siam sitting in the High Court, watching as oral arguments take place, where you have the Nawar family essentially arguing against the prosecution, who has a plea deal ready to be accepted with the individual that has killed his son. So to give a sense of the obstacles that Palestinians face in achieving any type of accountability, right? You have the prosecutor whose purpose is to represent this family in their quest for justice and accountability. And the family is arguing against the prosecution in the Israeli High Court, right? Because they do not support this plea agreement. And sitting there, it becomes very clear that this isn't necessarily about 50 years of occupation. This isn't about green lines. This is really about pervasive and entrenched denial that continues to perpetuate impunity, right? That denies Palestinians justice and equality, that denies rights, and perpetuates 50 years of occupation. So I'll leave it there.